welcome to another podcast of Seeds of Wisdom with me, Kimberly Klein. Today I want to talk about a very emotional and controversial subject, and that is God. What is God? What isn't God? And what do you believe God is? The subject of God comes up for me a lot, in fact, at least once a day, because being spiritual and being out there in the world, being known as someone who's spiritual and writes about spirituality, etc., people often ask me, hey, what do you think God is? Or, I think God is this and this and this, so how can you possibly view God as this and this and that? So I want to talk about what I think this and this and that is. And more importantly, what I think God is not. In fact, what I think God is not will probably be the bulk of this discussion, because in reality, I don't know exactly what God is. I have my viewpoint and my feelings about what God is, but what I really have is a very strong opinion and some background information about what God is not. And for me, God is not the God of religions, meaning any religion. It's not the God that uses fear to rule, judgment to rule, and allows certain people into his heaven and certain people into what they call hell. I do not believe in that heaven and that hell or that God. So I know that's stepping on a lot of religious people's toes, but I actually don't think that those religious people even listen to my podcast. So with that being said, the God that I believe in is something that you can call by any name, whether you call it God, the creator, the universal energy, the source of all things, whatever you want to call, that is what I call God. That opens a lot of doors to what God actually is. So if you look at it from a scientific point of view, you can say God is the universal energy or the source of all things. Now, there are a lot of scientists that have become spiritualists, Greg Braden for one, that you can read about, that explains, the universal energy and the source of all things and how that energy connects everybody, how we're all part of that. And in fact, if you're just getting into the subject of spirituality and how science fits into that, Greg Braden is a great resource. If you start to read Greg Braden's works, and they go back, 30 years, his books are really easy to read and to understand how science meshes with the spirit. So I highly recommend Greg Braden. There's some other scientific people, Brian Greene, you can read those books if you want a scientific background to spirituality. So back to what God is for me. God for me is that universal energy that runs through all things, that connects everybody, that is in every cell and every atom, that connects all the plants and the animals and the planets and the stars and the microbes and the people all over, including whatever's living on other planets. So for me, that is what I call God. But there's issues, because the word God has meaning to people who believe in the Bible and other religious texts. God has a persona. People look at that God as the God that we were made in the image of. Therefore, that God is in our image. So they look at that God as a person or a soul that looks like a person, who acts like a person, who has the same feelings as a person. And if they have the same feelings as a person, then there's the same flaws as a person. And that's where that God uses fear, intimidation, judgment. Because people have fear and they intimidate and they use judgment. So all of the flaws that humans have, that God has. So why would there be a creator, an all-encompassing, all-powerful creator that created everything, the earth, the universe, the galaxy, the people, the animals, the plants? Why would that God need those negative emotions? Why would that God need any emotions? Why would that God need to control using fear? Why would that God judge? It just doesn't seem right that something so powerful would use something so earthly, so humanistic, so minor, in order to control. And that's what you have to look at. If that God is using human qualities to control humans, maybe that God is not actually the God that we think it is. Maybe that God was man-made. Maybe that God was made for the sole purpose of controlling people. Maybe that God was molded by other people in order to control people. So if you look at the time the Bible was actually put together, the Romans were trying to control the civilization. So there were people going wild. And so they put the Bible together. And of course their God is going to use whatever means necessary to control the people that the Romans wanted to control. So you need to look at that. Whenever there is power, you need to look at who's benefiting from that power. And then you can tell whether or not that person or entity that has the power is legitimate. In fact, along that vein, there are a lot of books, a lot of studies, a lot of archaeologists that have come out and said that there are a number of books, I think 22 or 26 books that were written at the time of the Bible that were not included in the Bible. That when the Bible was actually put together, the controlling powers that be that actually organized the Bible said, we are not putting these books into the Bible. And so they didn't. So how legitimate is that if they took part of the Bible and left it out? And if you look at the books that were left out, those books are the books that take away the power of the politicians, of the rulers of the community of that time. Those are the books that have the words of Jesus that actually gives the individual the same, if you want to call it powers, the same abilities that Jesus had, that God has. So, of course, the rulers of the time, they did not want that put in the Bible because they wanted absolute control. They wanted their God to cast fear on the public so that they could control. And look at what that control got them. That control got them thousands of years of power and money. And to this day, look at the churches are huge. They are money-making machines. And that would not have happened if those books that were left out of the Bible were included, because the individuals would have had their own individual power, not the controlling bodies. So if you're wondering where you can read information about this, if you read the Course of Miracles, that book is Jesus speaking from the spirit world, saying to the world, listen, here are my real words. These are the words that I said when I was alive, and this is what I actually meant. And on top of it, here is what I'm saying now. And if you read the Course of Miracles, it's very detailed. And it's really very interesting because Jesus is speaking from the spirit world and saying, listen, this is what I really meant. So you don't need to go through the preachers and the rulers in order to get to God. You have the power within yourself that I had to go to God. And on top of that, the God that you've been taught is the God of judgment and fear is not really God. God does not judge. God does not use fear to rule. God does not rule. So I really recommend that you read the Course of Miracles. Now, like I said, it's a very big, thick book, but it's really interesting. And if you don't want to read the Course of Miracles itself, there are hundreds of books written by Course of Miracle experts that you can read and you get the gist of it. And there's audios that you can listen to, and you can go to lectures. It's really very interesting. Now, another source of information that agrees with the Course of Miracles, and I say, how could it not agree? Because it's Jesus's real words coming from the spirit world, are the Gospels of Mary Magdalene. And I know Mary Magdalene is pretty controversial to the religious community, but Mary Magdalene, she speaks Jesus's real words. Jesus spoke to her directly, and she, in her Gospels, say exactly what Jesus told her and what she learned from him. And that's another reason why her Gospels are not in the Bible, because they take away the power from the rulers of the time and give it to the people. And I think that's one reason why the church doesn't like her and casts her in a negative light, because they're trying to poo-poo everything that she says, because what she says is truth, and what she says is directly from Jesus, and that's truth. Now, some people might be thinking, well, why are you talking about Jesus so much if you're spiritual, not religious? But here's the thing. Jesus was spiritual. Jesus wasn't religious until the rulers made him religious. So way back then, people were spiritual. They might have belonged to a particular religion back then. In those days, those religions were spiritually based. Jesus learned from the Essenes, and the Essenes were very spiritual. And the Essenes now are looked at as a cult and some crazy kooks. But the Essenes were in touch with the universal force, the powers that the universe has and that everybody's born with, the ability to speak to the spirits, the abilities to heal. Both of those are birthrights. And even my daughter Talia, from the spirit world, in her book, The Universe Speaks, The Heavenly Dialogue, she says our birthright is to be able to communicate with the spirit world. And I know that's true because, one, she said it and she cannot lie. When you're in the spirit world, you cannot lie. And the only reason that people don't know it is because they're taught that you can't, or they're told that it's evil, or it's bred out of them through the generations of people not believing. So it is your birthright. It's your birthright since the beginning of man to be able to communicate with the spirit world and the animal world, if you want to go there, and the plant world even as well. But to stay on the subject of what God isn't and what God is, I have to come back around to I believe God is that universal force that everyone is in touch with, and that universal force is what allows and lets us communicate with the spirit world and lets us just know something. You ever have that feeling when you just know something? Well, that is us being in touch with the universal force, the consciousness, the unified consciousness field, if you want to say it in a scientific manner. And that force, that universal consciousness, that universal energy, the energy that runs through all things, to me, that is what God is. The word God has a prejudice attached to it, and that's where people get messed up. That is where the religious community has their feelings about God, and that's where the spiritual community needs to separate it out. And if you are trying to get in touch with your own spirituality and in touch with your God, then some people have problems doing that because the word God has so much judgment put on it. In fact, nearly every day I get into an argument with somebody over the fact that they say there is no way there's a God. I do not believe in a God who rules and who says, if you don't do this, then you're not going to heaven. And I say, I agree with you completely. I do not believe in that God either. And they say, well, but you believe in God. And I say, yes, but not that God. You need to change the word. If you separate that out, if you just forget everything you've learned from your religious studies or going to church or just growing up and hearing what you think God is, if you forget about it and you forget that there's a word called God and you change it to the spirit that runs through all things or the universal force, something like that. So whenever you read God, blah, 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 change that word to something else. It will not have the judgment anymore. So if you say, I have the power to heal, just as the universal force. That sounds different than I have the power to heal just as God does. So someone who has a preconceived notion of what the word God means and who God is, they're never going to be able to get over that and understand my view of what God is without a lot of work. Never, I can't say never, but it's going to take a lot of work. But if you can just strike through that word God and change the word to the spirit that runs through all things, something like that, and read the sentence again, then you can start to understand what my God is and what a lot of people's God is, and how it's not the God of judgment and fear. Now, going back to the Gospels of Mary Magdalene and the Course in Miracles, there are a number of other books that I can recommend that you can read if you want to, that will help shed light on what Jesus actually said. If you're going to misinterpret what he said and form an entire religion based on it, then in order to rectify the situation, you need to go back and actually read what he said for real and understand the meaning of some of the words that he said and what they meant back then, not how they were interpreted and translated and what their modern meanings are today. And one example is the word sin. Sin is a word that really bothers me because there is no sin in the way that modern religions use the word sin. If you go back and read what the word sin actually meant when Jesus said it, sin meant to go against your authentic self. Now, going against your authentic self means something completely different than the meaning that the modern religions use for that word in order to control their constituents. And as far as your authentic self, living true to your authentic self is one of the most important things that you can do. And that topic is so big that I'm not even going to get into it here. That's a topic for another discussion at another time. So back to some other books that you can read if you want to know what was actually going on at the time of Jesus and what he actually said. Now, if you like past life regression therapy, there's a person named Dolores Cannon. Now, she's passed away, but she has a huge institute, and she has dozens of books out. And some of her books, her patients have regressed through her regression therapy to the time of Jesus and the time of the Essenes, and have said what they learned and what was going on at that time. And it's completely consistent with the Course in Miracles and what my daughter says in her books, The Universe Speaks a Heavenly Dialogue, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and also the Gospel of Thomas. So you can read some of Dolores Cannon's books. One of them is Walking with the Essenes, and the other is Between Life and Death, and another is Walking with Jesus. I might have gotten the titles a little bit wrong, but you can look them up, and those books are really amazing because those people have regressed into the spirit world, back into the time when they were living at that time, and they are talking about how people lived and what their spiritual beliefs were and what was actually said and by whom. So those are really great books to reference. So that's about it for now. I do want to come back to this topic with some guests on the show because this is something that is really fun to talk about and have a dialogue. So I will do that. But for now, that's it for what my view of God is and what my view of God isn't. And if you want more information or if you want to send me some questions or comments, you can do that to my website, www.kimberlyklein.com, or email me at kim@kimberlyklein.com. So thanks for listening. Until next time.